Welcome to another episode of The Aligned Life, The Goddess Life, where we dive into living life fully aligned, mind, body, and spirit, peaceful and unbothered. I'm Hallie, your host, and I'm here with my co host, Ashley, for our first episode of Trauma Talk Thursdays, where we are going to explore the different aspects of trauma healing, how that meshes with spiritual tools and practice, and kind of share experience. So today we'll start off with an exploration of who we are, how we connected to psychology, and give a little bit of background so you can have that little bit of understanding of where we're coming from. And if you don't mind, Ashley, I'll go ahead and go first. So I have I'm currently in school as a psychology major to become a licensed therapist counselor, specifically trauma informed with a focus in mental health counseling and working within the aspects of females who have had sexual trauma or physical abuse. Those are kind of my key points. I personally have had a lot of experience in both of those realms. I also have experience with narcissistic abuse. I have experience with chronic post traumatic stress disorder. And for the majority of my life, I have kind of therapeutically helped myself and others to move through these difficulties to find their standpoint and how they're able to stand in their own power. Um, from a spiritual perspective, I was early on drawn to working with deities who connected with this, like the Morrigan, and specifically her aspect as Bive, and diving into these ideas of sovereignty, which carry large themes in the spiritual trauma healing that I do, which I currently do under the Goddess Life Spiritual Healing. What's your background and story look like, Ashley?
So it is very similar to yours. I'm also working on finishing my degree, but I am certified as a Master Evolved Neuro-linguistic Programming practitioner, which is basically a really complicated way of saying that I have extensive training in working with the unconscious mind to help people resolve a lot of their challenges that they're going through. And in that training, we also go through trauma informed coaching because coaching isn't a regulated industry in the United States. And I knew enough when I started getting into the spiritual advisement realm that trauma is a very, very tricky thing to work with. And you can accidentally re-trigger someone very quickly. So I knew enough to know that I didn't know enough. Um, and that's what led me to seeking out the training and the coaching. So jumping backwards, psychology has always been a side hobby of mine, always wanting to understand people and where they come from and how they see and perceive the world, how they make decisions, all of that. And then when I finished high school, I ended up in the Army as an intelligence analyst. And to shortly explain what I did is my job was to know the enemy and predict the future. So that was a lot of psychology, a lot of patterns within it. And over the course of my career in the Army, I was appointed as the sexual assaults and harassment response coordinator. So I worked directly with victims who had been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted and was that first point of contact and the one that led them through all of the process from reporting to getting the resources that they needed in order to start the process of healing. And in that, you're required to go through continuous education every month. And we had a psychologist come through and talk to us one day about trauma. And having been through my own stuff, it was a really eye-opening lecture because I learned that, our brain goes into what they call an amygdala hijack, where we just cognitively aren't processing things. And our brain almost kind of gets stuck. Like when you experience a trauma, it's very common to hyperfixate on a sound or a certain sight. And those things can very subtly re-trigger the unprocessed trauma later on in life. And when I learned that, that was really validating to my own experience. So fast forward to working with the Akashic Records and doing all of these readings for clients, I, of course, would attract people that had been through very similar experiences to me. And I was really worried about re-traumatizing them unintentionally, right? Because when you're talking about karmic patterns, it's not always a pleasant experience, right?
Right.
And usually we have reasons for why we made these choices that aren't aligned to who we are. Um, and we didn't have a lot of choice years and years ago. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that women had the right to own a credit card or property, so a lot of the karmic patterns, there's some trauma in there, and it tends to repeat lifetime after lifetime. So what I'm seeing in past lives is also being presented in current lives. So that's really what led me to seeking out the trauma informed coaching certifications and kind of just put me into this space. So predominantly, I work with sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic violence victims, as well as those who have experienced childhood trauma, and not necessarily the extreme kind. This can be neglect, parentification, um, overreactions by parents, and it being hyper internalized by the child, now adults.
Yes.
So those are the things that I really focus on with my own clients, and helping them find their power, because that was one of the biggest things that I needed. Is I felt out of control. I felt like I lost my power, lost my choice. And being able to find my power through seeing my own choices, and seeing where I could take responsibility for certain things to prevent it from happening in the future, was the thing that really, really gave me that sense of power back, gave me that sense of sovereignty, as you mentioned, right?
Yes.
Um, and I found that really healing.
I'm so glad that you were able to find a healing in that. I spent most of my time very confused about trauma for a large majority of my life. So uh, I currently work with people who have a lot of those sexual traumas also. We're very aligned in that particular type of work. But in my particular path, so I was first diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a child.
Hmm.
And that was so weird in like 1992 because and we don't think of it that as being like super long ago because it wasn't, but that was still a time when they thought that post-traumatic stress disorder was something that was curable, something that didn't last forever unless you were in the military or experienced some type of like extreme violence. And it is so interesting where we have ended up now and all of this research that has happened, like you said, working through those different generational ideas and kind of cutting these karmic cords in order to improve the way that we work with trauma and work with um those personal connections, because it's not always the parent child connection that typically does have a huge contribution to where people are at, but there's so many other connections that also play into that. And there's also so many of those that lead into different relationships with that parent child, that the way that we've evolved is very interesting. And I appreciate that you have taken the time to go through the coaching trainings and certifications. I have not gone through the certifications, mostly because, like you said, it's not regulated in the United States, and I find it really difficult to find one that fits exactly the specifications that I want it to for the type of care that I want to provide to people. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I struggled very similar to that because a lot of the certifications, it's like this $8 click through training, right? Uh,
Yes.
so I actually found Avalon Empowerment, the company that I went through for all of my training. I found them through my own synchronicities and serendipity, right? As I
Oh,
had awareness of being like, I am not prepared enough to deal with this trauma appropriately, and I don't want to re-trigger them. A
yeah.
few days later, this Facebook ad popped up talking about how they were doing trauma informed coaching training. So I sat down with them and did the introduction to kind of feel it out. And they're telling me about all this neuro-linguistic programming and quantum time release stuff. And I'm like, I don't need that. I just need the trauma informed coaching. Well, little did I know how useful all of those other tools were going to be in actually working with all of this trauma.
Yes. That's a big thing is not re-traumatizing and pulling in all of those empowerment pieces. As I was kind of coming into my realization that it was time for me to start this particular healing journey with others, I actually had a lot of I'm pretty good at helping not to further traumatize. I have always been more so worried about the different techniques that I'm using and how effective they're going to be with people.
Mhm.
And that's where I found, similar to the idea of like merging those quantum ideas with the that trauma informed care, like utilizing Reiki and utilizing different forms of ritual have been so phenomenally life changing, not only for myself, but for others, as we meld them in those therapeutic techniques. It's amazing how much they line up.
Oh, absolutely. Um, Even a lot of the neurolinguistic programming tools, I remember going through the training and I was like, this is very similar to some of the guided meditations I see. When I went through the hypnosis certification, it very much felt like you were walking people through a guided meditation, and it's just different ways to help people de-identify with the problem so that they can look at it um,
Yes.
and allow it to be, right? Without it having to be a part of their identity,
Yes.
because we aren't our trauma. It might shape us and help us become the person we are, but we aren't that experience. We discover who we are within those experiences is how I like to look at it.
I like that. That's a good way to pull that empowerment back into the self. It's, it's so interesting that neurolinguistic programming, we see it a lot in EMDR.
Mhm.
And that's something I talk to trauma patients and people who have experienced trauma, or at whatever title we want to give them. If you have been through trauma, EMDR is at least something to check out because it helps for you to become objective. And it is so similar with that idea of guided meditation and finding presence, removing yourself from that. I'll define this statement once I'm done, but that egoic self and being
Mhm.
able to see the higher self through it is the ultimate purpose of that reframing, reshaping, and being able to validate and then create safe space for those inner children, for those pieces of you that experienced it. Um, it is something that, and again, that idea of the egoic self or that egoic state, when I say that, I'm not saying it from this weird esoteric idea that is removing total attachment like we see through spiritual practice. That egoic state, from a psychological standpoint, is your emotional state. And I'm sure, as you know, since we're both, diving down this, emotions are an override for your body, for your mind. And so when they're triggered and they are heightened, your brain can't do the logic very well. So learning those tools to reframe and reshape that and pull yourself out of that helps for you to reevaluate, step back. That's also been a huge theme this week, is reevaluating things, because you can take a step back and be like, okay, how should I take this? How should I react to this situation? How is this affecting me long term? And what am I supposed to take from it without that emotional reaction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to look at the ego as the safety mechanism of the body, right?
Yes.
It is very much that core survival mechanisms and the things that we've learned that help keep us safe. But safe doesn't always mean comfortable,
Yes.
especially if you've survived trauma. And one of the things that I've had to really learn as I adjusted from getting out of the army and into civilian life is my stress threshold is abnormally high. So I have a really high toleration point, but that doesn't mean that I need to go all the way up to the top of my threshold because I have so many lived experiences of high stress. That doesn't mean that that has to be my steady state. And it's going to feel really weird and uncomfortable and almost boring. Rebalancing and re-regulating my nervous system to be at my baseline. But I lived in such high stress for so long that it felt really weird to come back to it.
Oh, that
And
makes total sense.
yeah. And then the other thing that I started to notice was I started looking at emotions as like the soul's inner compass, right? Emotions aren't, their energy in motion is what we hear all the time, right? But if you look at it as a guidance system, it's electric currents shooting through your body, trying to guide you towards or away from a situation, right? So anger is usually masking other emotions, but it can tell you, I'm very passionate about this and I disagree with this situation.
Yeah.
Or it's masking fear and it's saying, I don't like this. I need to get away. And when we hold on and identify with those emotions, they get stuck in our body and we get stuck in those experiences. But if we just stop and ask ourselves, okay, what motion is this emotion trying to drive me towards or away from, right? Um, it's a lot easier to navigate that way and understand it that way. At least for me, being a very analytical, left brained type of person by default, like that really, really helped me. Despite being an empath, like I could feel the emotions and they were really uncomfortable. So I would try to logically process them. So
Yes.
understanding it as the soul's guidance system was something that really, really, really helped me in giving myself permission to feel those emotions and to listen to the guidance that they're trying to give me.
I like that. I've never heard of them being that inner compass, but that is exactly what they are. Um, and that is something uh, for for people who are able to do that big objective out of self experience. You can utilize that to kind of predict how the situation will go before you really take the time to react. When you go through that idea of self-evaluation and evaluating exactly what's happening and how you're going to move forward in it, you can use that to be like, okay, well, like you said, I'm angry, but this is because I'm passionate. This is because I may not want to get hurt and I'm predicting that I might get hurt.
Mhm.
And you can look at that situation and see, well, am I really going to get hurt? And
Yeah,
I feel like that also helps for us to fully evaluate. I'm going to use big air quotes here because we can never really know, as people who have gone through trauma, we very much are trying to anticipate what another person or situation has as their ulterior motive, which doesn't always exist. And it's really hard for us to realize that that's not the norm for people to have ulterior motives. Sometimes people are asking questions or making statements because they need to address it or confront something. They need to move forward and have a little bit of freedom in their choices and what they're doing. And when we have that approach us when we're walking into a situation, we're very much like, well, what did they really mean? Like, how much do they not like me or not approve of what I'm doing? Are they mad at me? Are they secretly like trying to connect with other people? Are they replacing any part of this? And so we need to also have that point to be able to step out of that and be like, okay, well, are they really, or are they just saying something because they also have a human need?
absolutely. So, one of the things when I'm teaching using emotions as guidance is the first step is always body awareness. Body language is always going to tell us, and as as someone that's lived through several different traumas, right? I would lock up my body. So it was very hard for my body language to move fluidly, but there's still that inner pull, right? Either forward or backwards, depending on if you agree or you disagree. And in having that body awareness and recognizing the feeling of agreeance or of repulsion, right, where you're pulling back, helped me to really kind of take that first step of recognizing, is this something that I'm comfortable with? And then from there, just kind of recognizing my own needs. But I wanted to kind of comment about that tendency to overthink and go through and worry about other people's thoughts and stuff. We call that mind reading in NLP. And through the course of my own journey, I've learned that a lot of times, I'm going to say it bluntly and then I'm going to explain. Okay.
Okay.
We think that people are thinking about us more than they actually are.
Yes.
And so, like me as a person, right? I might make a comment to you and be like, oh, that's an interesting color, right? And you might have 15 million different like thought processes that stem off of what I meant by that. And I simply just was like, I've never seen that color before. That's interesting. Or I like it, right? But you're going to immediately insert a lot of um your own wounds into those statements, right? Like you're probably going to wonder, does she like me? Is she making a dig at me? Does that look bad? And go through all these different possible scenarios, and those are your thoughts. Those aren't my thoughts. But what happens is when we're doing that mind reading, we're putting all those thoughts onto somebody else as if it is true, and then we react from that space. But
Mm-hmm.
really, they're they're your thoughts. They're your responsibility, and it's an indication of your own challenges. And when I catch myself doing that, especially in relationships, man, I do it so much in romantic relationships, and I've gotten better. But I will catch myself doing that and hyper analyzing what they mean by something. And I have to really like pull myself back when I catch myself in those spirals and be like, those are my thoughts. If I
Yes.
want to know, like one of the things after my divorce, I very quickly learned was to not make assumptions and to instead ask questions. Like if I'm going through and interpreting this 15 different ways, ask clarifying questions instead of making assumptions. Because I definitely, made a butt out of myself when I leapt to a conclusion thinking that my ex meant something a certain way when it was actually innocent. So that was a big takeaway in that moment for me. So I always just I will be that obnoxious question asker. I would be like, what did you mean by that?
Yes. Yes. Oh, I cannot clap enough for that. I feel like that is super common. Like you said, especially in romantic relationships, romantic partnerships, whatever that aspect looks like. That is such it it combines this need for outside acceptance with this internal need for outside validation,
Hmm.
and that creates this system. And sometimes we just haven't really been, I'm going to also use big air quotes here, been taught to do that. But truly, that typically comes because we have found that I'm drawn to something that I went through in class recently, where we were talking about how we're taught to infer emotions in
Hmm.
different types of conversation. And without it being something where it is just like a person says, "Hey, I don't like the way you did this." And instead, the person's like, "Well, I would have done it this way." And that sometimes creates this tension, this that where we're diving into our own personal emotions and trying to defer to whatever we think the person is meaning, when we need to be practicing that trusting things at face value and accepting that a person may not be trying to hide something from us, or infer something different. I'm drawn a lot to the second of the Four Agreements. Have you read the Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz?
Oh man, it's been a minute.
I constantly talk about them, so I also apologize to our listeners because you all will probably hear me talk about this like 1,000 times. But the second of the Four Agreements is to not take things personally, and
Hmm.
it's so fitting because when you hear that at face value, you're like, okay, well, that means that I just don't need to take things as heavily as they may come across. And although that's part of it, the bigger part is for us to realize, just like you said, that people aren't thinking about us. People are
And
thinking about
you said
themselves.
you said this statement. One of the statements that we're always looking for in NLP is complex equivalence. It's they did this, and that means, and
Yes.
that's where we're mind reading. That's where we're projecting our own experiences and our own thoughts and our own challenges onto somebody else. So, like anytime I catch anyone, even myself, especially myself, in a that means type of thought, I'm like, hold on, let's dial this back because that means that that's my thing.
Yep.
You know, that's my thing, not necessarily their thing. So then it's kind of coming back to, okay, well, what's true about that? You know, is that
Yes.
actually their thought? Does that actually mean the same thing to them?
I also
And
want to put like a little thing in here. And I'm sorry for cutting you off. I promise I'm going to let you finish. I just want to put a little thing in here where there's a difference between this inference and this language and needing reassurance, because
oh,
we can
absolutely.
need reassurance and expect reassurance from a partner. And I'm going to use the word expect there because I your partner should be willing to do that for you if that partnership, if you are both secure. But there's a big difference between the two. So don't take this as we're saying that reassurance is not okay, because it is. That's a wonderful thing. I'm
Oh,
sorry, continue.
absolutely. Um, I don't remember what I was going with that, but
Oh, sorry.
when you are, I do have something to add to what you were saying, right? When you're seeking that reassurance. So some tips that I learned through my own journey and the army kind of helped that along because I was a very rebellious, very blunt person. So I had to learn how to communicate what we call tactfully, basically politely, right? And my own daughter has ADHD, so I've really had to figure out communication. And one of the things that has tremendously helped is one, first getting their attention, because I operate off of this default assumption that they are always on, always listening for my voice to come on to talk to them, right? And how true is that? Not really, because I know whenever they're talking to me, my brain is probably going through something else. I'm engaged in something else. So it takes me a minute. So one, grab their attention, right?
Yes.
Two, tell them what you need. So, hey, I need to run a few things by you that are going on and see where you can take some of this stuff off my plate. Or, hey, I just want to bounce an idea off of you and get your advice on how you would handle the situation. Or, hey, I just really need to vent and I just need you to listen. Right. So tell them what you need from that interaction, right? And that will help them then know what is expected from that conversation. Because growing up with my own mom, it felt really invalidating when I would share something with her and she would return it with her own story. And it almost felt like a one upping. And I realized later on in life that it was her way of relating.
Mhm.
Um, it's just the way that she went about it felt invalidating. So I learned it made me really paranoid that I was doing the same thing to other people, right? So I
Yes.
learned, to tell them what I needed. Hey, I just need you to listen. Or I would ask when somebody comes to me, I'm like, do you want me to just listen? Do you need advice? And when we grab their attention and then tell them what we need before we say what we need to say, it helps shape that experience so that it is more conducive to actual communication. And then really making sure that you're not putting people in defensive mode because the moment they're on defensive mode, they're not hearing you. I mean, think of times that you felt defensive in conversations. You're not being heard. You're not hearing that other person, right? You're busy planning your response.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if you see someone's triggered and put into defensive mode, immediately pause the conversation. Whether they need to recognize it, or you need to recognize it for them, or you need to recognize it for yourself. If you sense that defensiveness, immediately pause that conversation because it's not going to go anywhere. You know,
Yes.
pause
Or
it.
somebody's going to say something that they do not mean or that they do not want
Mhm.
to, or it is going to have, again, that inferred idea of, well, I'm going to say this, but I'm saying this so you understand how angry I am with you.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and I think that's one of the big challenges is we just want to feel heard, especially if we're looking for that validation or reassurance. We
Yes.
just want to feel heard. And the Army always taught us to give feedback when we were given orders, and we would paraphrase what was said in our own words. And that is something I've carried with me to this day. Is I will repeat back briefly what I understood from what you communicated. And that tells you, I hear you, I understand you. And this is what I'm going to continue the conversation with.
Oh, I like that. I like that idea of paraphrasing because it shows that you're present, that you're here for the connection instead of for your own personal ideas or just for your own personal side.
Absolutely. And then it also kind of takes away that defensiveness too, because if you don't feel heard, you're going into defensiveness. You're going to keep escalating how you communicate your point, right? Uh,
Yes.
and it's going to be repeated in more and more aggressive manners typically, or you have the opposite end of the spectrum, the passive ones that will just disengage more and more and be like, yeah, whatever, whatever you
Oh,
say, you're right.
right.
you know
Oh man, that that reminds me of a conversation I had with someone recently where we were talking about accepting the views of another person or where another person is in their own path
Mhm.
and understanding that we have this need of what are the words I'm trying to use here? Um, Essentially, what was happening was there was a huge disconnect in understanding of a problem. There was a problem that was split in so many different ways that everyone had a different idea and a different perspective. And no one could like come together on it because everyone was so in their emotional state and so in their own healing of it that they were like, no, this is right. And this is what I feel. No, this is right. And this is what I feel. But if they had taken that time to do that paraphrasing, they probably
Mhm.
would have had a much different experience. And they probably would have been able to kind of sit down. And I think ultimately it did kind of resolve in that way. But there was so much overlap of different needs and different viewpoints that they couldn't really come down to that level space and be like, okay, that paraphrasing I'm gonna use that more. I like that. I have never thought of that before.
So it's interesting how much I've taken from the army. I know I keep like talking about it, but like that's where a lot of my adult experience was.
I mean, no,
But
I welcome it.
listening to your example, it reminded me of the military's problem solving steps, right? And the first step before you can get anywhere is to define the problem. And if you allow everybody to define it in their own way and provide input, it helps you really capture the full thing. And that leads you into like step two, where you analyze the problem. And once you really have a solid problem statement, then you can start evaluating the options. But like first you have to know what specifically is that problem and how does it become a problem, right?
Yes.
But that those different perspectives, those different viewpoints are so crucial to capturing that whole problem. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it go wrong when it's just one person and one opinion that says, "Oh, this is a problem," and I think that this is how we're going to fix it, but they lack all the other surrounding puzzle pieces to understand how that one solution would actually impact negatively several other involved parties, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So
And uh
having that diverse input is so important.
yes, and I feel like that kind of like leads into another point that I wanted to touch on in our trauma talk today, the idea of acceptance.
Mm,
Because in this particular aspect, one, acceptance has about 100 different meanings when it comes to psychology. Oh, I take that back. It's not 100 different meanings. It's one meaning applied to 100 different scenarios. Because acceptance is the acceptance of the self. It
mhm,
is accepting the views of others, accepting that there is a need to find that common denominator, which having that like round table with everyone has that analyzation brings you to a point where you can sit down and be like, okay, what's the baseline here?
mhm.
What is affecting all of you? And all of you have taken it into all of these different pieces. And in that, we'll need to accept that Some people are going to have other little pieces that they're like, okay, I know probably all of us have been in this situation where we're having a round table issue like this, and we sit down and we're like, okay, so this is the base thing, but I also want, like, I need X to be recognized as a problem. And,
Absolutely.
oh, sorry, continue.
Oh, I was just gonna say, for me, acceptance is always about preferences, right? It's acknowledging a preference.
Yes.
Um, Especially if it's something that's opposing your own viewpoint. It's just you're gonna kind of push back against it, but it's just recognizing your preference within that, and then allowing the other one to exist, right? And I'm always trying to distinguish the difference between preferences and needs because we get them mixed up easily, right? Like,
Yes.
I have a certain cup that I like to use for refilling the water reservoir on my coffee maker, and I had a guest over and they used that cup for their coffee. And I would, the cringe moment where you're just like, "Mm,"
Yes.
and I had to like, remind myself, like, that's not a need, Ashley. You can use another cup. It's
Yep.
fine. It just doesn't work as perfect as that other one. It is just a preference.
And it's just for now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so like because I always see a lot of shame and judgment, especially when it comes to trauma. And when I really started looking at judgment and shame, right, I realized that judgment is just a projection of someone else's preference. And
Yeah.
shame is whenever we take it personally and internalize it and say, oh, well, I don't meet their preferences, so I must be wrong. I must be bad.
Oh yeah, 100%. Um, I also I see how acceptance and preference is like they they very much do overlap and hold hands. Um, I also attribute I think for me personally, I attribute acceptance a little on a different level because I put it up there with that idea of not taking things personally as that note, as that rule or agreement where it is
Hmm.
like, okay, like it may not necessarily be your preference to be as willing to allow someone to have their own voice in something. And to kind of elaborate on that, that is not typically what goes through the mind when we have those situations, but it is essentially what's happening. Let's say you're in a situation and someone comes up and you're like, okay, hi, how are you? And then the person goes, well, I am having the worst day ever. All of these things have gone totally wrong. And I believe that it is the fault of X, Y, and Z. And you working on taking back your power and not putting your judgment, your ideas, and not taking things personally, you're accepting that that person is having the worst day. You're accepting that they're in this particular state, and you're also accepting that you're not going to put yourself into it. Does that
Yeah,
make
and
sense?
I think yeah, and I think that allowance might be a better word for that, right?
Yes, that would be more along the allowance side. You're right.
Because like I don't know, acceptance for me is very much about not pushing back and just allowing opposing things to coexist, right? And then allowance is then that next step is okay, I accept this is a preference of mine and it does not match mine, and then allowing it from there.
So I
Okay, it's
love
supposed to
that.
coexist.
I love that because as you were defining acceptance, you were like, does acceptance is allowing these two things to coexist, and
Mm-hmm.
allowance is accepting the like essentially the outcome or however it is going to play out.
Yes,
And that just
absolutely.
shows how entwined the two are.
They are. I mean, it's very much a hand in hand kind of thing. And once you're able to really get into that space of allowance and acceptance of others and opposing viewpoints and stuff, it really changes the validation game, right?
Yeah.
Because the judgment comes in and we are really harsh and critical on ourselves, and then that drives that need for external validation. But if we are really in that acceptance and allowance space, we're able to validate ourselves and our feelings and our preferences, right? As well as our needs.
Yes. Very much so. I'm sorry, I'm also like taking notes. But yes, absolutely. I know we're coming up on like our hour mark. Would you suggest any particular way of like working with both allowance and acceptance hand in hand? Or do you feel like they should be worked with individually before merging the two together? When I work with it, I find you kind of have to kind of do them at the same time,
Hmm.
but I want to get your thought on that.
Yeah, so it definitely is a 1-2 step, not a one pause two,
Yeah.
right? I think it is very much like a quick step from one to the other. And when you're working through that acceptance, whether it's of yourself, it's of others, whatever it might be of a situation, it's just kind of, looking at where the preferences are for yourself, but also, where the mind reading, the judgment, the shame come in, and what those statements are. So that way you can start to kind of disassemble them and step into that allowance space. Because we're taught a lot of things as we're growing up, and those things might not be true for us anymore. But until we are willing to step into it a bit more and really look at it and name it, it's hard for us to know. So like that judgment, right? Um, for example, I used to feel shameful if I ended up in a relationship that turned out really bad, right? And even there was a little bit of shame that my marriage had failed. And I realized that there was a lot of judgment and fear of judgment going on. And when I kind of stepped back, I looked at what those statements were and kind of like identified what's my preference versus what's somebody else's preference. Whose preference does that belong to? And do I agree with it? Do I need to carry it? And that kind of allowed me to give myself the acceptance of the situation, but also allow it and allow other people to have their own opinion without it impacting me because I was able to not take it personally and just recognize it for what it was.
Yes. I feel similarly. I've had similar situations, even outside of relationships, just and so part of my trauma comes directly from people being overly critical of me. And so there's a lot of shame in there's a lot of shame, believe it or not, in conversation for me. Coming from places where I'm not agreeing with what somebody thinks or
Right.
where I am voicing a differing opinion in like most ways. It's it's so interesting because then I have to go through that idea of being aware of what like we said earlier, what someone's intentions are. And that is where the big idea of like taking things at face value comes from in my particular world. And then also going through the acceptance and allowance of myself to have those differing ideas and opinions, and understanding that one, of course, that shame is coming from me at this point in my life. It is coming from me, and it is something that I have allowed to go on.
Hmm.
Um, and not only that, but it has made my voice so quiet in certain situations that I allowed so much else to happen. And so working with the two together has been really eye-opening for in my personal life, just me personally. It has been really eye-opening for me to understand, oh. just because I may not know what another person knows or do what another person does not mean that I don't have intelligence or capability or am able to share space with them. It means that we're two different people sharing space. And we're sharing these different ideas and these different connections and communications, and we can learn from each other. We can do that. As you can imagine by me explaining that, starting this podcast has been a huge development in my own healing process.
Mhm.
It has been fantastic for that, but that has always been a very, very difficult thing for me. And I'm glad that you brought up shame. Well, I'm gonna write down shame for like our next one because again, we're coming up on that hour point. Um, but this has been wonderful and eye-opening, and I'm so glad that I get to sit down on Thursdays and talk trauma with you. I think this is going to be fantastic. Thank you for spending time with me today.
Of course. I've had a blast.